Washington Outsider Report on the Coalition Radio. For those newly joining the program, my name is Irina Zuckerman, and I'm the editor-in-chief of the Washington Outsider. Today, we are having a book talk with a special guest, Peter Grant Jr. He's a writer and researcher, VP of Conference Content and Global Healthcare, former editor-in-chief of Population Health Readmission News and RX Data News, and he's the author of the book concerning the corruption of democracy. We'll be examining his research into Putin, into Trump, and into the ties between the Trump campaign and some of the Russian intelligence and political operatives, and re-examining some of the thorny questions that came up in the last couple of election cycles, the controversies. We all know that the Mueller report was deeply flawed, it was disregarded, but what was everything about the allegations concerning Trump's campaign entirely false? Actually, the Senate Intelligence Committee report pointed to a high degree of Russian interference in the U.S. Democratic process. And the book, While We Slept, Vladimir Putin, Donald Trump, and the Corruption of American Democracy, will help us figure out what actually happened, what was serious, what we should be concerned about, and what was the product of media stories and uncertainty. Peter, thank you so much for joining us today. Before we get into this, could you tell us a little bit about yourself, your background, and how you came to be interested in this topic?
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much for having me. So as you mentioned, my background is actually in writing and research, and primarily professionally, I work in healthcare policy. In addition to that, I've also worked on several presidential campaigns. So I have an interest in presidential politics and the nature of campaigns themselves. I worked in 2008 in Ohio and in 2012 in Florida, so kind of important swing states. And I worked for the Obama campaign, just full disclosure with that. So how my interest in the book came around, actually, it didn't really start out as a book project. In early 2017, following Trump's surprise victory, and especially when news of his and his campaign's relationships at that time, and still somewhat very mysterious relationship with Russia, came around, I began circulating among friends a series of articles that I believed should be read if you wanted to try to understand what was a highly complex and developing news story. And as I kept on adding news articles to that list, I eventually transitioned it to an Excel document, and I started just adding every single article that related to Trump and his campaign's relationship with Russia. And eventually, over about 2.5 years, that article list exceeded about 9,000 articles. And so after the release of the Mueller report, which was, the Attorney General, William Barr, completely misrepresented and essentially lied about the contents of that report, I decided to start writing about the issue. So I took 6 months leave from my job in September of 2019 and began writing what I thought was going to be essentially just an extended essay. As we all know, in March of 2020, the pandemic hit, and all of a sudden I had a great deal more time. And so what began as an extended essay turned into a much more ambitious project, a larger book, essentially, which was looking at not just the events of 2016, which was covered by the Mueller report, by a variety of legal documents, and by the Senate Intelligence report, and a whole bunch of congressional testimony and international reporting. But I also looked into the history of it, not only Donald Trump's long history of connections to individuals connected to Eurasian organized crime and Russian money laundering operations, but also Vladimir Putin's personal history in the KGB, his rise to power in St. Petersburg, where he himself became deeply connected with organized crime figures in St. Petersburg, and later his rise to power in Moscow, and then his ascendance to the Russian presidency, much of which involved the manipulation of domestic elections, which I thought was an interesting parallel. The fact that Vladimir Putin was manipulating domestic elections in Russia for a very long time. And so it seemed to me a natural progression that he might try to do the same thing, just using different methods in the United States. So my background is in writing and research. This began as a personal research project, which extended over a period of years. And then I just decided to try my hand at writing something, and the book is the product of that rather long and arduous effort.
So I'll get to how you ended up writing the actual process in a little bit, and I'll certainly get to your comments about the Mueller report and how it was misrepresented. But I actually want to start with the historical background and kind of work backwards towards the contemporary events that we think we're familiar with. So let's talk about, let's actually start with the Trump and then go to Putin. And let's talk about his history, because there's been some reports about Trump going to Moscow in the 80s and looking into real estate transactions and supposedly coming back with some political shifts and ambitions. What do we really know about that period of time and how that came about? And was there anything earlier than those events to point to his interest in Russia or Soviet Union at the time?
Yeah, so even before that, just talking about Donald Trump's I'm not political rise, but his business, how he essentially became the real estate magnate that he was. So his father, Fred Trump, was a major
Mhm.
developer in New York City, primarily in Queens and in Brooklyn. And at that time, if you are going to be working in construction or any number of other businesses in New York City and elsewhere, you are going to have connections to organized crime. And this was actually mainly pointed out in an absolutely excellent biography of Trump. The first one ever written, which is actually the best one, was written by a Village Voice reporter named Wayne Barrett, who in the late 1970s was writing about corruption in New York, and he came across Donald Trump. And so Trump's father, Fred Trump, had a individual who was connected with the Genovese crime family. And what this meant was that basically, at that time in the 1970s, organized crime had fundamentally burrowed its way into the labor movement. And so, if you had construction workers who you didn't want to go on strike, as a real estate developer, you would largely be interacting with individuals linked to organized crime who has essentially control of the various unions. And so Fred Trump had connections, as pointed out in Wayne Barrett's biography, The Deals and the Downfall, with the Genovese crime family in order to manage labor of the people who are working on his various construction projects. Now, by the time Donald Trump came of age, his main ambition was to move into from the outer boroughs, Queens and Brooklyn. He wanted to develop buildings in Manhattan. And so he became connected with the infamous attorney Roy Cohn. They met at a club in Manhattan, and initially the Trump organization was being sued for racial discrimination. The American Department of Justice sued the Trump organization because they found the FBI basically discovered that the Trump organization was not allowing African American individuals to rent units in their buildings. And Trump was represented by Roy Cohn, who was an attorney who also happened to be the attorney for the major mafia families in New York. And so Roy Cohn, who had deep connections with the city of New York, including the mayor's office, basically facilitated what was at the time the largest tax abatement in New York City history, to allow Trump to develop his first tower in Manhattan, which actually wasn't Trump Tower. It was the Grand Hyatt Hotel, which is in Midtown in New York. And so Donald Trump had connections with individuals, in particular Roy Cohn, who were connected with organized crime. And the concrete company that poured the cement for Trump Tower was jointly operated by the Genovese and the Gambino organized crime families, which were the most powerful organized crime families in New York. So Donald Trump rose to prominence in a context in New York City where he had connections with the most powerful organized crime groups in the city. And it was only later in the early 1970s when Russian organized crime first was introduced into New York City. And how that happened was in the mid 1970s, the United States changed its trade policy with the former Soviet Union, with the Soviet Union at the time, to basically penalize the Soviet Union if it did not allow its Jewish population to be able to leave the country. And so when that was called the Jackson-Vanik Amendment, it was an amendment to our trade policy, and that eventually passed. And then a large group of immigrants from the Soviet Union left the Soviet Union. A smaller subset traveled to Israel, and many ended up in Brighton Beach, Brooklyn. And a small minority of that group were involved in organized crime. And what they were doing primarily was they were doing scams with Medicaid. They were doing Medicaid fraud, but even more lucrative, they were essentially doing what was known as a gas tax scam. Basically, they were selling gasoline, and then instead of paying tax dollars to the US government, they were pocketing it and hiding their ownership through a series of shell companies. And one of the main individuals who was involved in these scams was a man by the name of David Bogatin. And he eventually, and this is also pointed out in Wayne Barrett's excellent biography of Trump, The Deals and the Downfall. He paid Trump $5.8 million in cash and bought multiple units in Trump Tower as a means to launder his criminal proceeds. And he had a personal relationship with Donald Trump, which was one of his early relationships with individuals connected to organized crime. Two others, so after Donald Trump built the Grand Hyatt, which was facilitated by his relationship with Roy Cohn, the televisions that he bought for the hotel were purchased from a electronics store in New York called Joy Lude Electronics, which was owned by a Ukrainian named Semyon Kislin, who the FBI assessed to be laundering money for organized crime and to have been facilitating the movement of money from the Soviet Union into the Western financial system. And another individual who owned Joy Lude Electronics was a man by the name of Tamir Sapir, who was from from the country of Georgia, which at the time was part of the Soviet Union. And Tamir Sapir was also being investigated by the FBI for his links to organized crime in the former Soviet Union. So essentially, Donald Trump in his early career had connections to American organized crime and came to prominence at the exact time that Eurasian organized crime from the Soviet Union, became started in Brighton Beach, Brooklyn, and began to extend its influence in the United States. So we don't know exactly the nature of their relationship, but we do know that Trump did have a relationship with these individuals. And if you follow it over the next series of decades, there was just more and more connections. So essentially, in my book, what I do is I point out over the decades all the different relationships in chronological order that the former president of the United States had with individuals connected to Eurasian organized crime and connected to KGB and later Russian intelligence money laundering operations. And while we don't know exactly what Trump knew and how close he was to these individuals, the pattern is overwhelming and consistent over a period of not years, but decades. And so in the book, I point that out. And I just think it bears mentioning and further investigation.
So at what point did these dubious business connections and personal relationships transform into any sort of a political interest or business interest that had a political impact? Let me put it this way.
Yeah, well, it's actually pretty fascinating. So Donald Trump had he met the Soviet ambassador to the United States. I believe his name was Yuri Dubinin, um, in the at a party hosted by Ronald Lauder. Um, Roy Cohn was friends with Estee Lauder, who was the billionaire cosmetics magnate. And so Donald Trump knew the Lauder family, and he met with the Soviet ambassador, who later then visited Trump at Trump Tower and invited him to go to Moscow. So in 1987, in July of 1987, Donald Trump traveled with his wife, Ivana. And just to backtrack a little bit, Donald Trump's wife, Ivana Trump, was a Czech immigrant. And when she married Donald Trump, that came to the attention of the STB, which was Czechoslovakia's intelligence agency, which was at that time part of the Soviet bloc and had a relationship with the KGB. So Donald Trump's marriage to Ivana kind of put him on the map with Eastern Bloc intelligence. And so in July of 1987, Donald Trump traveled to Moscow. And afterwards, when he returned, Roger Stone, who is Donald Trump's long-term political advisor, took out very large page, full-page advertisements, basically echoing a theme that Trump has talked about for many years, was that the United States was being ripped off by its allies. And then Donald Trump's presidential interest, he began floating the idea that he might run for president, which wasn't taken all that seriously, but it was interesting that it took place immediately after his visit to Moscow. And stranger still, after he visited Moscow, the publication Executive Intelligence Review, which is connected to the Lyndon LaRouche organization, which many people have suggested is trades in conspiracy theories, and is a rather bizarre, fairly interesting publication. But they wrote right after Donald Trump returned from Moscow that the Soviets were interested in Trump as running for president. You can make of that what you will, but that's a fact, and we have the publication itself. So, and Donald Trump also met with Mikhail Gorbachev, who was visiting the United States. And Donald Trump had an interest in nuclear disarmament issues, and in typical Trumpian fashion, he would make ridiculously hyperbolic claims such as he could solve the Cold War in an hour if he met with Mikhail Gorbachev. And so Trump has always had an interest in the in Russia and in the Soviet Union dating back to the 80s. He visited there, and shortly after he returned, he seemed to have an interest in running for president. Now, whether that was discussed with anyone while he was in the Soviet Union, no one knows. But that if you look at the timeline of events, um, it's just fascinating that he began to, suggest his interest in presidential politics after he visited Russia.
So you just made a whole host of very interesting points. I want to break them out piece by break them down piece by piece. So let's start with the Soviet ambassador portion of the story. First of all, what was the Soviet ambassador doing at Ronald Lauder's party? Why was he relevant given the Soviet position concerning the Jewish situation and with the refusing and all that, given that Ronald Lauder is a very prominent member of the Jewish community?
Yeah, so Ronald Lauder, it may have been his brother, because there's, but basically he was at a party sponsored by the Lauders. I actually don't know why.
Mm-hmm.
It was mentioned in, of all things, The Art of the Deal, where basically Trump talks about meeting the ambassador for the first time. I'm not entirely sure why the ambassador was meeting with them at that time. Um, but he was, and he that's just where Trump happened to meet him.
Mm-hmm.
So that would be something that would be worth looking into for sure.
All right. So, okay, so that's shrouded in a mystery, but we know the ultimate outcome. Now, Roger Stone, as we know, is Nixon's guy. And Nixon, one of the things he became famous for is opening up China's markets to the West, to the United States. Was there this some sort of ambition on the part of his former associates like Stone to do the same thing with the Soviet Union, to kind of break down the trade barriers and to open the Soviet markets to the US, to the US, to the US? Was that the ambition, or was there something else involved?
So I don't think that Trump was that sophisticated when it came to that. He was making very bold claims about solving the Cold War, but I don't think he had that clear of a policy vision for the
Mhm.
relationship with the former Soviet Union. And as it relates to Roger Stone, Roger Stone was basically just peddling Donald Trump's political career, and I don't think really had a coherent foreign policy or economic policy. What was interesting was what Trump was pushing at that time in the late 1980s was he was basically suggesting that Japan and Germany were ripping off the United States, which was happened to be very much what the Soviets were wanting to promote in their propaganda because they wanted to weaken the relationship between the United States and its allies. And this has just been a constant theme of Donald Trump's, where he has basically suggested, and this goes back to our relationship with NATO and comments made today, where that somehow the United States is being ripped off by its closest allies and they need to be paying us more money. And that was the message that when they took out, including in the New York Times and several other papers, full page advertisements in which basically they were suggesting that the United States needed to kind of change its relationship with its foreign allies because they were somehow ripping us off. And so that was the primary message that Trump was promoting, and Roger Stone was largely just promoting Donald Trump's domestic political career. I'm not aware of any economic policy that Roger Stone was promoting, other than, like I said, Trump was essentially suggesting that the United States was being ripped off by its allies.
Now, do we know who exactly was Trump meeting with in the Soviet Union? And also, regarding the Gorbachev meeting, what was the outcome of that? Since Trump was obviously making these wild claims that he'd solve the entire, Cold War as soon as he met Gorbachev, what was the outcome of the meeting? Was there any discussions concerning nuclear non-proliferation And what happened afterwards?
I really wish I knew the exact content of that conversation. We don't know. It's basically, Mikhail Gorbachev visited the United States during the time of Glasnost and Perestroika, and he met with a series of business leaders. One was including the Michael Milken, one of the bankers who promoted the idea, who basically created junk bonds and things like that. And I think basically Mikhail Gorbachev was hoping to economically reform the Soviet Union so that he didn't want it to collapse. And so he was trying to reform the economy there. And so when he visited the United States in the context of his meetings with the Reagan and later George H.W. Bush administrations, he met with a series of business leaders. And in some time during that period, he met with Donald Trump. I sincerely doubt that Trump had any actual economic advice to proffer to the Soviet premier at that time. But nonetheless, he did meet with him. And then afterwards, Trump also met with a series of nuclear non-proliferation experts. I believe the man's name is Bernard Lown, and basically made outlandish claims that he could solve the Cold War in an hour and things like that. So the exact content of their conversations is not known. Um, but he did meet with him, and then he left the meeting making very kind of extraordinary and somewhat ridiculous claims of being able to solve the Cold War and whatnot. And us having lived with unfortunately with Donald Trump on the airwaves, him making outlandish claims is something that we all recognize and understand.
And we don't know what was the exact itinerary in the Soviet Union.
No, we don't. I mean, we do know that the Goss and Tourist was the Soviet travel agency, state travel agency, if you will. It was run by the KGB, and we know that they were the ones that organized it. And so his trip to Moscow in 1987 um, remains largely shrouded in mystery. He visited Moscow on three occasions, and he did it again in 1996. And that was more what I mean. So just to back up a little bit, he was interested in building a Trump Tower Moscow. That was a long-term ambition of Donald Trump's. And so most likely his discussions, him being a real estate magnate at that time, would have been surrounding the potentiality of him building Trump Tower Moscow. And so he visited in 1987, and nothing ultimately came from that in terms of the development of a Trump Tower Moscow. And then he did so again in 1996. He was traveling in Moscow with Leon Black, the head of Apollo Global Management, who later was had to quit because of his relationship with Jeffrey Epstein. But he also, at that time in 1996, was notably surrounding himself with young, beautiful Russian women, attending meetings with two women at his side, which people thought was odd. And so, yeah, so he visited in 1996. And then later he visited in the 2000s for the Miss Universe pageant. And so he's been traveling to Moscow multiple times, and generally it was to have discussions about the building of a Trump Tower Moscow. And he also did it for a model pageant, the Miss Universe pageant, and where he was discussing with the Agalarov family, who built Crocus Hall, which unfortunately was at the site where that terrorist attack by ISIS occurred recently.
Mhm.
Um, and basically, he was having discussing the building of a Trump Tower Moscow, and the furthest that ever got actually occurred literally during the 2016 election, when Felix Sater and Michael Cohen were in negotiations with in Russia to build Trump Tower Moscow. So it's been a long-term ambition of Trump's to develop a tower in Moscow. Those ambitions began in the late 1980s. They were furthered in the 90s when he visited Moscow in 1996, and they kind of achieved maturity and later in the 2000s when he was visiting Moscow for the Miss Universe pageant, and he was in negotiations with Aras Agalarov and Crocus, a development company in Russia. And Agalarov, as pointed out by the Senate Intelligence Committee, had deep connections with Eurasian organized crime, Russian organized crime, and with the FSB, Russian intelligence.
So, is there a clear connection between Trump's early links to the organized crime individuals that you described and these later relationships with the Russians themselves?
Yeah, I mean, so when the initial Russian, and I say Eurasian organized crime instead of Russian because, the former Soviet Union
Sure.
included Ukraine, Belarus, Kazakhstan, and so they weren't all ethnically Russian. So
Mhm.
basically, in Brighton Beach, when or Russian or Eurasian organized crime began, they ultimately had to work with American organized crime, who essentially muscled in and said, look, you're making, particularly the Colombo crime family and others, including the Genovese crime family, saw that Russians like David Bogatin were making an extraordinary amount of money through these gasoline tax scams. And so then the Colombo family basically said, you're going to have to share this with us, and we will protect you from other people muscling in on your business. And so in the late 1970s, traditionally, Italian American mafia, those families built a relationship with the Eurasian organized crime where they were basically working together on Medicaid frauds and on gasoline tax scams and things like that. And so there was this connection between American and Eurasian organized crime. And that happened at the exact time that Donald Trump was emerging as one of the top real estate developers in the New York area. And as we know through Roy Cohn and through the individuals that were managing his labor relationships with his construction sites and in his own personal life, Donald Trump was seen time and again as having, associations with individuals from American organized crime. And then he had a personal relationship with David Bogatin, who was a Russian organized criminal operating out of Brighton Beach, Brooklyn. And so Trump kind of emerged out of that milieu, and that's where his initial relationship started with individuals connected to Eurasian organized crime, and that only continued over the decades. And so that later you would see on Trump developments like Trump Tower Soho, one of the strategic investors of that was a man by the name of Alexander Mashkovich, who was later alleged to have connections with individuals who were involved in Eurasian organized crime and money laundering operations. And in Trump Tower, Toronto, his top strategic investor was a man by the name of Alexander Schneider, whose father-in-law, Boris Burstein, was considered one of the top individuals who was connected with organized crime out of the former Soviet Union and who was moving money from the Russian state into the Western financial system using his commodities trading firm. And so, sorry, you have a
No,
question?
no, no, go ahead.
So basically, if you look at over the decades, starting from the late 1970s, going into the 2000s, Trump has had repeated interactions, both on a business and personal setting, with individuals who both are A, connected with Eurasian organized crime, and B, connected with the laundering of money from the former Soviet Union into the United States financial system, which was also done primarily through investments in real estate and things of that nature.
So why wasn't Trump at any point a subject of any federal or state criminal probes, given his connections to outright criminals, and even as a witness, there appears to be nothing to suggest that he appeared as a person of interest anywhere publicly. How
Well,
could you explain that such a high-profile individual in a milieu of other very high-profile and suspicious individuals who would normally be investigated for all sorts of crimes, that there's nothing, nothing that has emerged about that at that time?
well, he actually was the subject of investigations, and he always seemed to be treated with kid gloves. Here's an example. So, Trump, began his career in real estate, but eventually he moved into casinos, and in
Mm-hmm.
particular, in Atlantic City. And so, New Jersey established a series of regulatory bodies that were supposed to keep organized crime out of the casino business in Atlantic City. They did not succeed. Uh, but basically, so when Trump was buying and building casinos, he was the subject of certain investigations, and those investigations did not um, fully unearth all of his connections to organized crime. And this was written about extensively by Wayne Barrett in his, and also in another book, Temples of Chance by David K. Johnson, where basically Donald Trump was investigated like a series of other people. So, for example, Barron Hilton, uh, the heir of the Hilton fortune, was denied a gaming license in Atlantic City because of his connections to a mafia-linked attorney named Sidney Korshak, who basically was the attorney for the main level gangsters out of Chicago. But Trump was investigated by the very same body, and his own personal attorney was Roy Cohn, who had far more connections even than Sid Korshak to the mob, and they completely disregarded that, didn't look into it, didn't even mention it, and he got off. So Trump was essentially had been investigated, and also just because he was taking cash from individuals who were linked to Eurasian organized crime wasn't necessarily in and of itself a crime.
Mm-hmm.
So basically, there were investigations. They just weren't serious, and they didn't fully go into all of his various connections. Some of which, while in hindsight, as a candidate for president, we would think, well, we don't want our candidates for president interacting and working with individuals with organized crime, but that wasn't necessarily going to prevent him from building a building or establishing a casino in Atlantic City. He himself, Trump himself was not a member of the mafia. He wasn't a gangster. He was a businessman who was interacting with these individuals.
Mm-hmm.
And you understand the history of New York City and of Atlantic City. That was largely how business was done. There was pervasive organized crime in both of those settings. But Donald Trump just consistently interacted with these individuals as a businessman. And that really, as a real estate developer, people weren't as, there wasn't a level of scrutiny as there would have later been or ought to have been as a presidential candidate. And he also had relationships with individuals in the FBI. There was, and he was wining and dining them, and yeah, so
That
he
was my
had,
next question.
yeah.
Whether or not there were perhaps factors or any sort of relationships he had with law enforcement, was he at any point considered to be a confidential informant of some sort?
While he was developing his casinos in Atlantic City, he met and spoke with individuals in the FBI, and whether or not he was a confidential informant with them is he was clearly speaking with individuals in the FBI. We don't know the exact nature of that relationship, and I wish I could be more clear
Because
on that.
let me put it this way, because it could explain why he was not more closely monitored given his extensive associations and why he was not publicly called as a witness when all these guys eventually were investigated.
Yeah, well, also just to just take a step back for a second. The FBI's relationship with organized crime over the years is very, very complicated. So for years, J. Edgar Hoover denied the existence of organized crime in the United States. And as we know, with their relationship with Whitey Bulger, they had individuals who were in organized crime who were also informants. The FBI occasionally appeared not to really investigate organized crime all that closely. So there's a lot of factors at play when we're discussing Donald Trump's interactions with the FBI. This is what we know. When gambling was legalized in New Jersey in the late 1970s, there was a major movement of organized crime to infiltrate the legal gambling industry at that time. And there was a series of FBI investigations going on, one of which notably was known as Abscam, where basically they were having a fake, actually the movie American Hustle is about this, good
Mhm,
movie. But basically they were having a fake Arab sheikh walk around offering money to individuals in New Jersey, and that caught up local politicians and various people, and through that investigation they realized that there was a massive amount of um, organized crime infiltrating the legal gambling uh, industry. However, that investigation in and of itself was partially, it got tied up with, were they entrapping people? It became a whole scandal in and of itself. And so the FBI's investigation of organized crime in New Jersey at that time was a complex involving potential entrapment, involving investigations of legal businessmen who may have had shadowy connections with organized crime. And then Trump arrives in that milieu as a kind of golden boy from the Manhattan and New York real estate market, and he was meeting with FBI agents and discussing whether, the attempt to prevent organized crime from infiltrating the legal gambling industry in Atlantic City at that time. The exact nature of his relationship, what he told them, what he didn't tell them, what he knew is just not clear. But we
mhm,
do know that as it relates to, so when he purchased, he ultimately owned 3 casinos in that area, and he bought the Taj Mahal Casino, which was the largest casino in the world at the time. And one of the high rollers there was the top Russian gangster in the United States at that time, a man by the name of Vyacheslav Ivankov, who was being followed and investigated by the FBI, who saw him gambling hundreds of thousands of dollars at the Trump Taj Mahal Casino, and he was also living in Trump Tower. So that's another. So if you're a casino owner and you have gangsters coming in and gambling great deals of money at your casino, what is the nature of that relationship? It's not entirely clear. And Trump may have been or may have not been telling the FBI, that would be something that would be, good to know. So I'm sorry I can't give you a more clear answer, but
but
it's
it
it's
is
a
a
very
very interesting context to understand that portion of this history.
Yeah, for example, like the entire legalization of gambling in New Jersey. So New Jersey was the first state after Nevada to legalize gambling. And this was in the late 1970s. And the company that funded the pro-legalization campaign essentially provided the money to promote legalized gambling in New Jersey was a company called Resorts International, which was a gaming company based out of the Bahamas that had previous links to the Meyer Lansky uh, gambling syndicate. All of this is covered in an excellent book by called Masters of Paradise, written by a Penn State criminologist named Alan Block. So Resorts International funded the pro-legalization of gambling campaign, established the very first casino in New Jersey, and that company in and of itself had significant connections to organized crime. And later they started building the Taj Mahal casino. And Donald Trump in 1987, within around the time of July of 1987, when he was visiting Moscow, bought the company Resorts International, which led to him owning the Taj Mahal casino, which was the largest casino in the world, where you had a lot of high-profile Eurasian organized criminals gambling at the time, and who, Vyacheslav Ivankov, who later was also found to be living in Trump Tower in New York. And so during my research, this actually was I thought to be one of the most interesting and most mysterious periods of Donald Trump's business career, because he's so often thought of as simply a real estate magnate, but the truth was he was also investing in casinos. And if you're going to find any other industry in the United States that has a high level of organized crime infiltration, you can't do much better than the casinos of Atlantic City, New Jersey. And I say that as someone who likes New Jersey. And so that's an area that I believe there should be a great deal more research done, because the amount of public information, I'm an open source researcher, so I'm relying on what's available to the public. And the information about that period of Donald Trump's career, there should be a lot more research done into it. And that also happens to cover the time period where he was having his initial interactions with the FBI. And you can't analyze Donald Trump's individual interactions with the FBI at that time without appreciating the larger story of the FBI's uh, very dodgy and bizarre investigations in New Jersey at that time, which included entrapment and Arab sheikhs and investigations of organized crime in New Jersey, which they have, let's just say, a mixed record at best at that time at investigating organized crime. And in fact, you could probably say that they were a very flawed organization with a long and somewhat mysterious history of not investigating organized crime. So it's something that bears further investigation.
So, as you know, that context in itself is worth understanding, but that brings me to another issue. All right, fine. The FBI has had its own checkered past that may explain a lot of blank periods, blind spots in this whole scenario. But Donald Trump, a high-profile American real estate magnate, goes to an adversarial country at the peak of the Cold War. Then, following that, in the future, he goes twice more to Moscow, by that point no longer an adversary, but also known for its corruption, organized crime, and assorted internal issues, to put it mildly. None of that attracts enough scrutiny to figure out exactly who he was meeting with, what he was doing there, and who he kept in contact with following those visits. That to me is very interesting, because from a security perspective, um, the associates that would be meeting with somebody like that in an adversarial country would have been of interest to US and many other intelligence agencies around the world.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, so we are looking at this with the benefit of hindsight, because we know that ultimately Donald Trump is going to be elected the president of the United States in 2016. I think it bears keeping in mind that before that, this was an almost unthinkable outcome. No one would have guessed that he ever would have become the president. And so I think that he, for a long time, was benefited by the fact that a lot of people didn't take him seriously. They basically thought of him as kind of a carnival barker figure in the media. And so, and people in the 2000s and back in the 90s weren't really thinking of him as an important political figure. Um, Going back to his visit in 1996 to Russia, so that trip was organized by a man named Howard Lorber. And Howard Lorber owned a company called the Vector Group. And Howard Lorber himself has been known to have associations with individuals connected to organized crime. He, I believe it was to a Clinton fundraiser, brought a man by the name of Vadim Rabinovich, who has been alleged to be connected with high-level organized crime in Russia and in Ukraine. So Trump visited in 1996. He was known, he was going out and partying with Leon Black, who was, at that point head of Apollo Global Management. And and then he was also, the Senate Intelligence Report has a long and interesting section about this. There was another man who worked for Howard Lorber named David Giovanni's, who basically was known to kind of wine and dine Western businessmen, typically seemed to be involving beautiful Russian young women. And he was actually called to testify before the Senate Intelligence Committee, and he refused to. He lives in Moscow. Um, and so Trump was going there. He was visiting sites to look for potential Trump towers. It also bears mentioning that the Trump who visited Moscow the most is not Donald Trump, it's Donald Trump Jr. Donald Trump Jr., on behalf of the Trump Organization, has visited Moscow almost up to 8 occasions, I believe. So it's not only Trump, but also his family members. His daughter visited, Ivanka Trump visited Moscow in a trip that was organized by Felix Sater, who somewhat infamously was involved in the later 2016 Trump Tower Moscow negotiations. And he himself has connections to American organized crime, to Eurasian organized crime, and high-level connections both to intelligence agency, both to the CIA in the United States and Russian intelligence agencies. And Felix Sater brought Ivanka Trump to the Kremlin and arranged for her to sit in what was described as Putin's chair. And so Ivanka went to his office, sat in his chair. All of this was organized by Felix Sater, who later was taking the lead in the various Trump Tower Moscow negotiations that occurred um, in um, in 2016. And so just to kind of get back to your question, Trump visited Moscow on multiple occasions, his family even more so. During his visits, he was meeting with individuals connected to the Kremlin and individuals connected to Eurasian organized crime, primarily the Agalarov family later. And why didn't this raise too many eyebrows? I just think the fundamental reason is, prior to him running for the presidency, no one took him particularly that serious. He was essentially a celebrity who was thought of as looking into real estate deals that had no real national security implications. It was only after he became president, and this goes back to during 2016, there was essentially, and even when news came out that the Russians were hacking into the Democratic National Committee and were releasing, engaging in information operations designed to benefit Trump. I think the fact that no one took him particularly serious led to a lackluster amount of investigating him. And it was only after he became president in the period between like 2017 and the release of the Mueller report that there was kind of a great deal of public interest in his relationship with Russia that when that largely died away after the Mueller report was released and misrepresented by William Barr, and then there was just the endless series of Trump scandals and impeachments, and then the 2020 election. That there's been this kind of whiplash of so many different scandals that people don't aren't taking the time to look to more deeply focus on his relationship with Russia. And so my book only deals with the 2016 election. I had ambitions to write more. It's just it was too complicated, too long. I had to eventually stop writing. The book is long enough as it is. So I think ultimately, just again, to answer your question, the reason why there hasn't been or there wasn't investigations into his relationships, both with American organized crime and Eurasian organized crime, was that he wasn't taken all that seriously. And although there were individuals like Wayne Barrett and David K. Johnson who were writing about this stuff, it just didn't really have wide, large enough attention to the general public.
Would it be fair to say that the business sphere itself, not just Trump in particular, but the general area, was not thought of as a source, as a national security issue?
Um, I don't know if I'd go that far. I mean, real estate in general, I mean, after the collapse of the Soviet Union and in the lead up to it, there was a massive transfer of wealth from the former Soviet Union into the into the West, and primarily into the financial secrecy jurisdictions that were established and also in real estate in London and New York. And so this was a lot of this was illegal, but there was so much money being made by people in the West, including in our financial sector, that there just wasn't much attention being paid to this. And interestingly enough, um, after when Yeltsin was the president of Russia and realized that all of the Communist Party money had literally been removed from the former Soviet Union and put into the West, he hired a private intelligence company, Kroll, to investigate this. And it was led by a man named Jules Kroll. And Kroll went to the CIA and asked them if they would be willing to help him investigate the removal of money from the former Soviet Union into the West. And they essentially told him no, they wouldn't do that. And so there has been a lackluster amount of investigations, not simply into Donald Trump, but into the entire phenomena of the money laundering and movement of money from the former Soviet Union into the Western financial sector and into the real estate sector. And this has been a problem that's not just the United States. Britain has an appalling record of investigating, or rather not investigating this. And so that raises pretty profound questions as to why that is. One potential answer is that it was simple neglect. Another answer is that we weren't interested in investigating it. We were the wealthy individuals in the United States and Europe were making a fortune through corrupt money coming out of the former Soviet Union, and our law enforcement simply wasn't all that interested in investigating it. And it was only later that we realized this is a corrupting factor in our society. It's corrupting our politics. It's corrupting our business. And Donald Trump was a rather small part of a larger issue, which was the movement of money, which was impoverishing the people of the former Soviet Union. It's a very wealthy in terms of natural resources. They have an immense amount of natural resource wealth. It's just that wealth is taken by a very small percentage of people, and that happens to be parked into the West. Now, with the invasion of Ukraine, there's been some belated movement to try to deal with this. But it's something it's gone on for decades, and we have a very poor record of investigating the phenomena itself, and Trump is no different.
So that brings us to the crossover from the purely business sphere into politics, and this is where both Putin comes in and Trump's wide network of dubious associates, and trying to separate who knew what, how much they knew, at what stage was it, you know, did it cross over from that whole kind of neglectful, unscrupulous business scene into political influence, and at what point have Putin's designs played into that?
Yeah, so if I just may briefly go back to let's just discuss the phenomena of Russian money laundering and
Sure.
Russia moving money into the West. So one of the books that deals with this very well is Karen DeWeesch's Putin's Kleptocracy, which is a phenomenal book, and I highly recommend people reading it if they're interested. And so towards the end of the Soviet Union, and particularly even in the late 1970s, when Yuri Andropov was the head of the KGB, members of the foreign branch of the KGB basically came to understand that the centrally planned Soviet economy was doomed and it was not able to compete with the West. And so they realized that the regime is likely going to fall. And so what they did was they began moving, the KGB began moving Soviet Communist Party money out of the country and into the Western financial sector. And one of the ways they did that was through a partnership with organized crime. And one of the companies that was used to move Russian state or Soviet state money into the West was a company called Sibeko. And Sibeko was managed by a man named Boris Burstein, who has been alleged to have high-level connections to Russian organized crime, in particular the organized crime group, the Solntsevskaya Bratva. And basically, Boris Burstein had a commodities trading company called Sibeko, and Sibeko was managing the movement of Russian money into the West. And so Boris Burstein's son-in-law is a man named Alexander Schneider. And Alexander Schneider was the primary investor in Trump Tower Toronto. And Boris Burstein's a person that worked for him was a man named Alexander Mashkevich. Now, and Alexander Mashkevich is part of what's called the oligarch trio that owns ENRC, Eurasian Natural Resources, in Kazakhstan. But he used to work for the company Sibeko. He worked out of their office in Brussels. And Alexander Mashkevich was listed as one of two strategic investors in Trump Tower Soho, which was a Trump real estate project that was being managed by Felix Sater. So what does this tell us? It tells us that the former president of the United States was engaging in real estate projects, which we all know real estate is one of the top, if not the top ways to take dirty money, buy assets in the West. And so Donald Trump was working with individuals who were connected with what I would describe as some of the highest level Russian money launderers, basically people who are working for the company Sibeko. And you take that information and you put it in the wider context of Trump having years-long relationships with individuals from Brighton Beach, Brooklyn, connected to organized crime, and including Semyon Kislin, Tamir Sapir, David Bogatin, Vyacheslav Ivankov was living in Trump Tower, was a high roller in the Trump Tower, and Trump Taj Mahal. And so all of these individuals were connected to organized crime that had a relationship with Russian intelligence and was used initially to move Communist Party money out of Russia. And then after the fall of the Soviet Union and the rise of the oligarchs were basically taking their fortunes and moving them into the West as well. And so when Vladimir Putin was rising to power, so he had his career in the KGB. and he was working out of Dresden. And then after the Soviet Union fell, he moved to St. Petersburg, where he ultimately became the deputy mayor of St. Petersburg. And during that time, Vladimir Putin, and this is also the two best books on this. One is Karen Duish's Putin's Kleptocracy, and Catherine Belton's Putin's People covers this extremely well. Basically, Putin, when he became the deputy mayor of St. Petersburg, engaged in a series of business relationships with the local most powerful organized crime group there, the Tambovskaya Bratva, and Putin was basically very closely connected to organized crime in St. Petersburg, and then later when he became the president of Russia, and he was also tied in with what was called the Ozero Cooperative, which was basically Putin and a series of intelligence officials and individuals connected to organized crime in St. Petersburg, built a bunch of dachas around a lake and created what was called a cooperative, which was essentially a Soviet version of a corporation during perestroika. And they were basically a sophisticated way of getting money to Vladimir Putin, bribing him essentially. And so basically the point being that I try to make in the book is that even though they emerged in completely different settings, both Donald Trump and Vladimir Putin, as they rose to prominence in their various settings, had very deep connections to organized crime from Eurasia. And that one of the fundamental things that this organized crime groups were doing were taking money from the former Soviet Union and moving it into the West and into Western real estate. And there is an extraordinary series of connections with Donald Trump's business career and this milieu of individuals who was engaging in this activity. We don't know exactly the nature of the relationship, but what I try to point out in my book is there's so many connections over time, and it's so consistent that there's simply anyone with a functioning brain should be able to be concerned about this. This is something that we as Americans should say, do we really want to have a president of the United States who has been connected to these activities? And Putin then, became the president and was engaged, and we can maybe talk about this later, but part of his rise to power, go on.
No, I'm listening. Yeah, go ahead.
Part of, what Putin was engaged in was the manipulation of elections within Russia at the time. And then he exported some of those practices abroad. And so it's not so surprising. So what I try to say in my book fundamentally is that both Donald Trump and Vladimir Putin in their various rises to prominence were assisted and associated with organized crime groups. And so that connection is important to understand before you start looking into what exactly happened in 2016. And we don't know the exact nature of what that means, but I think pointing out all the various incidences of this is important, and getting a wider appreciation of who these men are, what their value system or lack of a value system is, and what their potential connections are. And as I pointed out, Donald Trump's these weren't just some random gangster on the street. These were very senior level individuals connected to money laundering activities that was sponsored by Russian intelligence.
So at that time, someone like Trump, who may not have been of an interest from a political perspective, certainly would have been of an interest because he is a real estate magnate, and what better way is there to hide ill-begotten profit than through real estate investments and money laundering? So is there any clear connection that this group of Putin-linked mobsters and intelligence operatives and basically that whole crew of people, that they were looking to Trump's real estate empire as a means of simply moving money for their own purposes?
Yeah, well, I think it's important to emphasize that at the time, Donald Trump was just a one part of a much broader phenomena, which was the movement of all this was a massive movement of wealth from the former Soviet Union into the West.
Mm-hmm.
And Trump was just a small node of that. It just happened to be that he became the president. So all of a sudden that becomes a much bigger deal. Had he never ran for president and had people just looked into this, they would probably, it wouldn't have been as significant. Um, but yes, in my book, I try to point out, that Donald Trump was engaging in business deals with individuals who were at close to the apex of what was going on. So if you read Karen DeWeese's book, Putin's
Mm-hmm.
Kleptocracy, she points out that one of the top KGB officials who was involved in the initial movement of it started out with Communist Party money. So some tens of billions of dollars was money owned by the Communist Party. And they realized that once the regime fell, that money was going to be seized by the new government. So the KGB, in particular, a KGB colonel named Leonid Veselovsky, was planning how do we move this money into the West and hide it so that no one will be able to find it and the new Russian government won't be able to seize it. And Leonid Veselovsky later went to work and worked for the company Sibeko. And Sibeko was a commodities trading firm that the KGB was using to move money into the West. And the owner of that company was a man named Boris Burstein. And as I said earlier, Boris Burstein's son-in-law, Alexander Schneider, was the top investor in Trump Tower Toronto. The bank that was also involved in that deal was an Austrian bank named Raiffeisen Bank. I may be mispronouncing that, but that bank was, and was revealed in the WikiLeaks diplomatic cables that were released. American officials believe that that bank was serving as a front for the activities of Semyon Mogilevich, who is another Ukrainian, post-Soviet organized criminal who has often been mentioned, particularly in the book by Craig Unger, House of Trump, House of Putin, to have significant links to Donald Trump. So Raiffeisen Bank was one of the parties involved in Trump Tower Toronto, and the main investor was Alexander Schneider, who was the son-in-law of Boris Burstein, and then Alexander Maskovich, who worked for Sibeko, was one of the top investors in Trump Tower Soho. So by pointing these out and putting it in the context of years-long relationships that Trump had both with individuals in Brighton Beach, Brooklyn, who were connected to the larger organized crime, Eurasian organized crime world, and then putting that also in the context of the fact that Trump visited Moscow on multiple occasions, and later during the election was pursuing a multi-billion-dollar Trump Tower Moscow deal and lying about it. And all of this in the context of events occurring during the election where Russian intelligence was engaging in information operations to benefit Donald Trump, and his own campaign, which we can get into, had many different connections to Russian oligarchs, to Eurasian organized criminals, to literally meeting with individuals who are described in the Senate Intelligence Committee as Russian intelligence officers. This paints a very damning portrait, and there's good reason to believe that Donald Trump had decades-long corrupt connections to individuals in Eurasian organized crime, and was welcoming the illegal acts of the Russian state to benefit his campaign. And the exact nature of his relationship with that operation remains not entirely known, but there's an immense amount of damning evidence to suggest that not only he knew about it, but could potentially have helped facilitate it.
So that brings us to the election itself, and we find that Donald Trump is surrounded by all sorts of floating characters political operatives, not just these ex-organized criminals involved in his real estate dealings, but actual political operatives who somehow or another either have already their own business ties to Russia and Russian pro-Russian sphere, or somehow end up being approached by Russians in the middle of the election. So where does this, business context end, and where does this other aspect, the political aspect, come in?
Yeah, so I think a decent place to start, prior to him running for president in 2016, Donald Trump went to Moscow and attended the Miss Universe pageant.
Mm-hmm.
Now, this has gotten a lot of, there's a lot of distortion here, primarily related to the Steele dossier, which basically made the claim, as we all know, that he went and had a
Okay.
golden shower.
Mm-hmm.
And which I don't, in my book, I don't write about that because I don't know whether that's true. There's no evidence that it is true. But here's what is true. What we know is he went and engaged in a business relationship with the Agalarov family.
Mm-hmm.
And Aras Agalarov is a Azerbaijani real estate tycoon and uh, oligarch whose son Eamon Agalarov is a pop star, and if you read the Senate intelligence report, they outright state that the Agalarovs have deep connections with organized crime and the intelligence services in Russia, and so Trump went, visited, got up to God knows what in Moscow, but we know that he was there and meeting with the Agalarov family, and there was the germ of the idea of them collaborating to make a Trump Tower Moscow. And so that process was underway as then Trump announced in, I believe it was June of 2015, that he was going to be running for president. And as he was running for president, which many people have believed that he did not, no one really thought that he was going to win. So I think that's an important thing to point out as well. And that includes all sides. So
Mm-hmm.
Trump himself, the
Mm-hmm.
FBI, the Hillary Clinton campaign, the Russians, no one thought he was going to win.
Mm-hmm.
And so he was running largely as a a publicity stunt, and during that time was in negotiations with the Russians to build a Trump Tower Moscow. And the individuals involved with that was Michael Cohen, as we know, who's in the news now, of course. And Michael Cohen himself has primarily through his family. Interesting connections to organized crime. His uncle was the owner of the El Caribe Club in Brighton Beach, Brooklyn, which was the headquarters of some very serious organized criminals, both on the American mafia, but also from the Russian Brighton Beach organized crime milieu. And he met his wife, was introduced to him by the daughter of Marat Balagula, who was a very serious organized criminal. And so Michael Cohen, and then there's Felix Sater, who had worked with Donald Trump on the Trump Tower Soho project, which I mentioned earlier, had connections to Alexander Mashkovich, who is connected with some high-level Russian money launderers. And Felix Sater has an absolutely extraordinary background. He was involved in he had connections with American organized crime through the financial industry. He was involved in pump and dump schemes that were managed by organized crime. And when he was being investigated by the FBI, he fled to Russia, where he somehow magically seemed to build a relationship with very senior generals in Russian military intelligence. So then Felix Sater approached American intelligence and said, "Hey, don't investigate me. I can provide you with important information." And the kind of information that he was providing was some of the most sensitive intelligence information in the world at the time. He provided U.S. intelligence with bin Laden's satellite phone numbers. And he received that information from the Russian GRU. And according to Catherine Belton's book, she was told by sources that essentially the GRU was using Felix Sater as a lure to basically ingratiate himself with American intelligence. I should be clear, those were things that were stated by sources speaking with Catherine Belton. I don't have direct evidence of that. I'm referring to the book Putin's People. And so these two individuals were going to Moscow during the campaign. They were interacting with the Kremlin. Michael Cohen messaged Dmitry Peskov, Vladimir Putin's I believe his media manager or spokesperson, and they were also meeting with a whole series of dodgy individuals to make the deal to do a Trump Tower Moscow. And this was occurring during the 2016 campaign while Trump was running, and Trump was being repeatedly asked, "Do you have any business relationship with Russia?" And he was lying and saying no. So that was one thing that was occurring during the election, which was an extraordinary scandal because the Russians, and another one thing to add is that Michael Cohen and Felix Sater and Donald Trump fully understood that for Trump Tower Moscow to be built, they needed the direct permission of Vladimir Putin. And they
Mhm.
even discussed offering him a $50 million penthouse, which almost certainly would have been a violation of the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act. So anyways, this was going on during the election, which in and of itself should be disqualifying because when Donald Trump is lying to the American people and to his own supporters, by the way, which I think is very important to emphasize, he wasn't just lying to the people who didn't like him and didn't support him politically, he was lying to his own supporters. And the Russians understood this. And so they knew that he was lying, and they
Mhm.
had in the means to prove that he was lying. And so it creates a counterintelligence problem. And so as this was occurring, the Russians were hacking into the Democratic National Committee and leaking emails. They also hacked into the Republican RNC, Republican National Committee. It's just they didn't release any of that information. And so, yeah, and that was just one aspect. There are many more, and in particular, his campaign manager, Paul Manafort, had an extraordinary history working with Russian oligarchs in Ukraine to support their interests. And during the election, met with Konstantin Kilimnik, who is a mysterious figure who's been described many different ways. The FBI said that he was associated with Russian intelligence. The Treasury Department and their sanctions described him as a Russian agent. And in the Republican-led Senate Intelligence Committee, he was described outright as a Russian intelligence officer. And so Paul Manafort, who had worked for the Russian oligarch, who was also alleged to be connected to organized crime, Oleg Deripaska, and was supporting the Kremlin's favored regime in Ukraine under Viktor Yanukovych, later was brought on as the chairman of the Trump campaign and was providing internal polling data to Konstantin Kilimnik, Manafort, that is, had a long-term relationship with Kilimnik dating back to his work in Ukraine, and then held a series of meetings with Kilimnik, including one in August at the Grand Havana Cigar Room at 666 Fifth Avenue in New York. And this was during the campaign where Paul Manafort met with Konstantin Kilimnik, who was bringing a message from Viktor Yanukovych saying that he wanted Manafort to try to bring him back to power in Ukraine. And they also discussed a Ukrainian peace plan that would have divided Ukraine along the lines that the Kremlin would have preferred, which was control of the Donbass and a variety of other things. And so what Paul Manafort, who lied about all of this, what he was mentioning to Donald Trump, they had numerous meetings. Paul Manafort was working out of Trump Tower, where he also owned a unit and was constantly meeting with Donald Trump and was the head of his literally the campaign chairman, and he was meeting with Russian agents. Other connections included Roger Stone, who was Donald Trump's longest term political advisor and was his lobbyist going back decades. Met him first in 1980, and Roger Stone was communicating with Russian military intelligence through Twitter. He was sending direct messages to Guccifer 2.0, and Guccifer 2.0 was a avatar created by Russian military intelligence, the very same unit that was involved with hacking the Democratic National Committee and releasing that information. They did so through the Twitter avatar Guccifer 2.0, and Roger Stone was sending direct messages to that. And we know through FBI search warrant affidavits that within 24 hours of him establishing contact via Twitter, he downloaded two encrypted communication applications. One was an email server, and the other was just a phone app that could have phone conversations. And shortly thereafter, Roger Stone predicted on Twitter that it would soon be John Podesta's time in the barrel. And lo and behold, the next series of WikiLeaks releases were John Podesta's emails. The exact nature of how he came about that information or whether it was a lucky guess, it's not entirely clear, but we do know that he was not only in communication with Russian military intelligence via Twitter, he was also communicating with WikiLeaks. And yet another node in all of this is George Papadopoulos, who was a foreign policy advisor for the Trump campaign, and he was working in London, and he met with a Maltese professor, Joseph Mifsud, who had just visited Moscow, and he then came to George Papadopoulos and told him that the Russians have emails related to Hillary Clinton, they have dirt, and they're going to release it to help Hillary Clinton. And later, George Papadopoulos told this to the Australian diplomat, Alexander Downer, who then, after the email releases occurred, Downer gave this information to the FBI, which led to the opening up of the FBI investigation into the Trump campaign. And George Papadopoulos not only told Alexander Downer that the Russians had Hillary's emails, he also told the Greek foreign minister. Because George Papadopoulos, he's a Greek, his Greek name, and he went to visit Athens, where in his capacity as a foreign policy advisor for Trump, he was invited to meet the Greek foreign minister. And the next day, Vladimir Putin was going to be visiting Greece, and the Greek foreign minister told this to George Papadopoulos, and then Papadopoulos told him, "Oh, well, the Russians have Hillary's emails, right?" And then the Greek foreign minister said, you shouldn't tell this to anyone. Anyways, in the investigation after the election, the FBI asked George Papadopoulos, did you provide this information to the Trump campaign? And George Papadopoulos did not deny it. He did not say, no, I did not tell them. He said, I can't remember. Now, I don't know about you, but I don't find that credible, and I'm not alone, because the Republican-backed Senate Intelligence Committee said they did not find this explanation plausible. And one of the individuals who was on the Trump campaign, who was the direct manager of George Papadopoulos, was a man named Sam Clovis. And Sam Clovis was asked to testify before the Senate Intelligence Committee, and the Senate Intelligence Committee later made a criminal referral to him about him, saying that they believe that he lied under oath to their committee. And lo and behold, the Barr Justice Department did not follow up and did nothing about it. So if you'll follow me here so far. So
Mhm.
Donald Trump is engaging in a multi-million-dollar negotiation to build a Trump Tower in Moscow. His campaign chairman is meeting with individuals connected to Russian intelligence, or as the Senate Intelligence Committee states, he's just an outright Russian intelligence officer. And they're talking about peace plans for Ukraine. And Manafort is providing him with internal polling data, which he was also in communications with a series of with Oleg Deripaska, who was a Russian oligarch allegedly tied into organized crime, and we know deeply connected with Vladimir Putin. And meanwhile, Trump's oldest political advisor, Roger Stone, is in communication with Russian military intelligence and WikiLeaks and making predictions about the releases that later turn out to be correct. And Trump's foreign policy advisor has been informed before it's public information that the Russians have Hillary's emails. And he tells this to an Australian diplomat, and he tells this to the Greek foreign minister, and then magically seems to forget whether he had any conversation with the Trump campaign about this. And then, and if that weren't enough, the list goes on and on. There are still more connections because famously, Donald Trump's son and Paul Manafort and several others later meet with Natalia Veselnitskaya in Trump Tower to have a meeting when they believe that she is going to proffer incriminating information on Hillary Clinton. Um, I could go on, but there's just many different connections. And what I try to point out is that there are gaps in our knowledge. We don't know the exact nature of what was discussed between Paul Manafort and Konstantin Kilimnik. We don't know because Donald Trump doesn't write emails and doesn't keep records. We don't know the nature of his discussions with Paul Manafort and Roger Stone, but we know that they spoke literally dozens of times during this time period. But what I try to point out in my book is if you look at it in its totality, at the very least, what you can say is that the Trump campaign was expecting to benefit from from the illegal activities of a very corrupt regime out of Russia, which is in itself, I would argue, disqualifying for the presidency. And the exact nature of whether or not they knew and potentially even facilitated this is still unknown, but the weight of evidence, I would suggest, strongly points in that direction.
So let's get back to Papadopoulos for a second, because back then and even now, I haven't seen any clear explanation for a few things. First, why on earth would he be talking to an Australian, to foreigners, any foreigners, even friendly foreigners from very friendly countries about this? What did he expect to happen? Second, did he at any point reported himself to the FBI as opposed to foreign diplomats and foreign and officials? And third, what was he after Mifsud told him this information? What was supposed to be the next step? What steps did they take to actually pursue that angle? And do we know if there's any clear evidence of Papadopoulos himself or anyone from his circles following up with Mifsud and pursuing that lead?
Yeah, so just to be clear, George Papadopoulos was not a senior figure on the Trump campaign. He was an unpaid foreign policy advisor. He did attend a meeting with Donald Trump, among several others, including and he was a networker, and he was someone that was trying to promote himself. And so when he got that title as foreign policy advisor to the Trump campaign, he went from a fairly obscure person to suddenly people became interested in him, and he was trying to organize meetings, and he ultimately tried to organize a meeting between Trump and Putin himself, which didn't end up working. So in the context of George Papadopoulos' self-promotion and using his relationship with the Trump campaign to do that, he met with Joseph Mifsud. Now, the question of what the Russians were trying to achieve, they could simply have been using this to just try to incriminate the Trump campaign. It could have been a lure to basically, because ultimately what the Russians were doing, and I try to make this point in my book because although the Russians, desired Donald Trump to be elected, that wasn't their ultimate goal. Their goal was an attempt to discredit the American political system. And basically, they were doing that by implicating the Trump campaign in criminality, which they understood would later people would discover. And so it could be. And so Catherine Belton makes this point in her book. The entire Trump Tower Moscow effort could have just been done to try to lure Trump into becoming associated with criminals and things like that, which would later come to light and then would put immense pressure on the American public political system because everyone would be outraged by this. And so it's not entirely clear. It's not clear whether the Russians went to told Joseph Mifsud to try to get George Papadopoulos to do anything in particular. It could have just been implicating him in a crime. But essentially, yeah. So George Papadopoulos, not a central figure, but had worked with the Trump campaign, and then he was promoting himself, trying to meet people and try to rise in the foreign policy world as a serious figure. And he was using his connection with the Trump campaign to organize meetings in London and abroad. He also had done work in Israel and things of that nature. And so he was just basically self-promoting himself. And in that context, met with Joseph Mifsud, who I actually believe he initially met at Link University in Italy. As to the question of George Papadopoulos and the FBI, we know that confidential informants of the FBI. So after Papadopoulos told Alexander Downer that it was at a bar in Kensington, and there was some question as to how much Papadopoulos had to drink, and basically he said in a fairly offhand way, "By the way, the Russians have Hillary Clinton's emails and they want to help the campaign." And Alexander Downer wrote this in an internal report, but didn't take it all that seriously because nothing had happened. It was only after the initial release of the Democratic National Committee's emails, which happened in the context of the immediately prior to the Democratic Convention, that Alexander Downer suddenly realized, wait a minute, this earlier conversation I just had has a greater significance than I initially credited it. And so then Australia, their diplomatic corps, informed the American FBI, which led to the launching of a investigation, the FBI investigation. And in the course of that investigation, they had confidential informants meet with George Papadopoulos and ask him and basically try to get him to say something about what he had learned, and he didn't really mention anything. But the facts are the facts. We know that he did learn about this information, and he claimed that he didn't remember telling the campaign. It makes no sense whatsoever. I mean, he was going around promoting himself. He's a big self-promoter. He's telling Australian diplomats and Greek diplomats, and he's somehow not going to mention this to the campaign. It beggars belief. And so I think the only significance of that episode is that he was also in communication with Steve Bannon, and there's a lot to the Papadopoulos story that's somewhat mysterious. I write about it at length in the book, but the major takeaway is that he learned this information prior to it being public, and there's every indication that, of course, he would have told the campaign, and so that simply would have been they would have known about it, and he didn't see it fit to inform American authorities and law enforcement that one of our adversaries was engaged in hacking activities against one of the major political parties of the country.
Unbelievable. So all of that creates a maelstrom of publicity and outrage, but the one thing becomes clear: a whole group of people around Trump certainly had reason to know about Russian efforts to interfere with the US elections. Now, the big question is, how much did Trump knew about that personally? And the second question is the Mueller report. what you mentioned that it was completely misrepresented. So let's talk about these two things.
Yes. So the Mueller report, which was heavily redacted and written in kind of a dense legalese that I don't think most Americans, it doesn't make for easy reading. Let me put it that way. And Mueller's investigation, if you read Andrew Weissman's book, Where Law Ends, they made a decision early on not to investigate Donald Trump's financial background. And the reason why they did that was because they believed that Donald Trump would have shut down the investigation because he said that's basically a red line. You weren't allowed to look into it. So the investigation itself, I would argue, was fundamentally compromised from the beginning
Mm-hmm.
in the sense that they were not going to investigate they did not do a counterintelligence investigation. It was a legal investigation. They did not, and also from the outset, they understood that they were never going to indict Donald Trump because of the internal Department of Justice policy that said you can't indict a standing president. And nonetheless, they did do an investigation and they uncovered an extraordinary amount of unbelievably not only just suspicious activity, but criminal activity, which is why you saw indictments of Paul Manafort, of Roger Stone, of George Papadopoulos, and others. And later, so they did the investigation. They said that despite all of this compromising information showing that the Trump campaign had so many different connections to various individuals in Russia, they did not ultimately determine that it amounted to a conspiracy, but they did not exonerate him either. So they wrote in a very kind of legal language that, if we could exonerate him, we would say so, but we don't do that here. Kind of a backhanded way of saying, well, he could actually be guilty, but we can't establish it beyond an absolute certainty. So we're not going to, and also we couldn't indict him in the first place. And we didn't do an investigation into his financial background, which, to our earlier conversation, really is the beating heart of his relationship with the former Soviet Union, is his business dealings. And so, I believe it was April of 2019, I could be wrong about the month, it was released. And then it was sat on for a period of weeks. And the only person who was able to read it was William Barr, who was the Trump appointed attorney general. And then Barr comes out and basically says they found no evidence. There was no there. He's innocent. And even the prosecutors in Mueller, including Mueller himself, wrote a letter to William Barr saying, you have misrepresented our work. And it was at that point that most of the American media said, oh, well, he wasn't indicted, so there must be nothing there. And then they just moved on. And then, what happened shortly thereafter was Mueller testified about his report. And then within 24 hours of Mueller's testimony, which he essentially hardly said anything, and basically Donald Trump had his famous or infamous call with Zelensky, where he basically said, do this investigation or we'll hold up the money for supporting your country. And at that point, we all moved into the impeachment and a whole other series of scandals, and most people left the events of 2016 behind. And so what I try to argue in my book was that the scandal, the 2016 Russia scandal involving Donald Trump was the original sin of his presidency. It was basically his engagement in corrupt and illegal activities that was including Russia's activities, basically set the stage for all the different scandals that would occur down the line. And so Mueller's report, which was written in dense legalese, was heavily redacted, and was misrepresented by the Department of Justice. showed only a sliver of what was occurring during the election. And then the main report was actually the Republican-led Senate Intelligence Report on Russia. It was 5 volumes, over 1,000 pages, but it was released in the height of the pandemic when everyone else was focused on that extraordinary historical event. And the head of the committee, Marco Rubio, the previous head, had to resign because of insider trading allegations after he had been informed that there was going to be a pandemic. I believe his name was Burr, sold his stocks. He was the head of the Senate Intelligence Committee, so he had to resign. And then Marco Rubio became the lead of the Senate Intelligence Committee. And then after that extraordinary report was released, which pointed out, I mean, dozens of unbelievable connections between Trump and his campaign with figures in Russia, Marco Rubio said, there's nothing to see here. This completely exonerates him. So actually, even though people generally think about William Barr as being one of the main public figures to misrepresent the various investigations into Trump and his connections to Russia, I would also point out that Marco Rubio also did so, and he did so with the release of the Senate Intelligence Report. But the Senate Intelligence Report was extremely long. Virtually no one read it. It was not very big in the news because we were right in the height of the pandemic. And then after that, the 2020 election occurred January 6th. And all of this has just been kind of shunted to the kind of the shadows of our memories of of his administration. When in my book, I argue that it should be front and center and something that we're continuing to look into and discuss.
Indeed, Donald Trump is running again for president. Russia is interfering in elections, not only in the United States, but around the world. And none of these people have really fully gone away. A lot of the Russian ends of these events have managed to flee and escape, and they're in Russia or elsewhere and unlikely to face any sort of serious questioning or justice regarding their role in these activities. The only thing we have to go on are the people here in the United States, but I also got the sense that their questioning or the information that came out of those questions was never fully complete, and it never was really created the full and honest picture of just how far all of this went at the end of the day.
Absolutely. And I think the investigation of Donald Trump and his relationship with Russia is obviously extremely important and pressing, mainly because he is currently a candidate for the presidency of the United States, and he is a unique, I would argue, threat. But there really needs to be a wider look and a wider investigation into the broader phenomena of the movement of money from the former Soviet Union into the West. And that is something that I believe has added a profound element of corruption, not only to the politics in the West, not only to electoral politics, but also just to business in general. And I don't think that absent that investigation, it can't Donald Trump's ultimate relationship to that can't be fully understood. And so I think that we need to, as a people, look into that. And my guess is that that's going to implicate a lot more people than Donald Trump. And I'm going to guess that there's probably a lot of people that don't really want that investigation to take place because it could potentially implicate major financial institutions across the West, banks and accounting firms, law firms that use to facilitate those corrupt activities. And Donald Trump was just simply one operator in a much larger phenomena that has deep implications not only for contemporary Russia, because ultimately the victim of the people are the Russian people. I mean, all that money and wealth has been removed from their society and put into banks and real estate and offshore estates and accounts and things in the West. And that, a lot of that money was taken through corrupt means from Russia.
Well, that is, I agree, an extraordinary situation we find ourselves in. We have all these leads. We have potential endless means for investigating all these leads and clues, and yet all of this seems to have been moved behind. I wanted to ask you before concluding, did you get a chance to interview any of these characters at any point?
No, I didn't. The book is fundamentally based on open source
Mhm.
information. It contains over 2,400 references and citations. And so, given just the extreme breadth of the material, I unfortunately didn't get a chance to interview people. But as I continue, I plan on continuing writing, and that is something that I will be doing in the future.
So we have a sequel to look forward to.
Hopefully, I mean, this book took me 5 years to write.
Well,
Um, and uh, I do, however, write articles as well, which I release on Medium. And so I'll be continuing to write those articles. And I would like the next book, this book stopped at 2016.
mhm.
And the next book, I would like to actually be writing about the investigations into Trump. That would include the FBI's Crossfire Hurricane investigation and the House and Senate investigations, and the special counsel's investigation, and all of those ultimately failed. And so that next book would be why the investigations failed.
The other question, and here I'm going to be a little bit provocative, is that people, on both sides of the political aisle accused each other of talking the talk, but not really working the walk when it comes to the investigations. Trump himself kept, calling for Hillary to be locked up, but comes his presidency, he was ultimately concerned with other things. Biden comes to office, gets into undoing, Trump's policies, whatever the case may be, but all of these things, all these Russian connections are not really investigated. Yes, a few people went down here and there, Paul Manafort and so forth. But the bigger, these law firms, these really big business connections, none of it is really touched. So people have questions about that. Is it that at the end of the day, our uh, political parties are not really concerned with getting to the bottom of the rut? Because that could undermine things they themselves are benefiting from, even if those very institutions also have massive corruptions under them? Is it the fact that Biden and his son were themselves accused of being compromised by Russians, Chinese, and so forth, and there is a conflict of interest there? What do you think is at the heart of the fact that this, for all the talk about Trump being a Russian agent and so forth, it never went beyond those initial investigations and never really touched the base of what's going on and never really went after the serious Russian assets in the US, which, if they were properly investigated, could have undone and made it very difficult for the Russians to operate in the US.
Yeah, that's a very good question. And unfortunately, it's not only an American problem. A lot of European countries, in particular, I think Britain is the worst at this, just refuse to investigate these matters. Part of the reason I think is that A, they're extremely complex investigations.
Hmm.
Speaking politically, these issues for most Americans is pretty obscure. It's very complicated, and people don't have emotional reactions to it often. Um, but I can't really provide you with an exact answer of why the Department of Justice in the United States does not seem to take these matters super seriously. I think and they are outgunned and undermanned. So they have a lot of different things, and there's just not enough lawyers for them and to engage in all different kinds of extremely complex litigation. But as I mentioned from the very beginning of Russian money laundering moving money into the West, there seemed to be a lack of interest of getting to the bottom of it. And my guess is because a lot of people were making a lot of money, and these were complex investigations, and the Department of Justice is often hesitant to get involved with that kind of thing. And we also have to ask about what the relationship was. between. I have often wondered myself, and I'm going to be a little speculative here, is that were elements of the Western, American and Western intelligence aware of this Russian money or money from the former Soviet Union being moved into the United States and into the West? And did they help facilitate it by essentially saying, okay, we're going to keep our hands off this and just allow this to happen? I'm not entirely sure about that. And so it could be that, I mean, for example, we know that some of the gangsters in Brighton Beach had relationships with the Central Intelligence Agency. And there were even cases where prosecutors in the Eastern District of New York were told, drop the investigation into these certain individuals from Russian organized crime. And so it's an interesting question is, were some of these Russians assets of also Western intelligence, which gave them some amount of protection from prosecution. And so that's one of the more interesting and provocative potentialities that I think bears further investigation. But there's been across the board a broad disinterest in investigating these matters. It's not entirely clear why, but it's something that I myself will be looking into in the future, and I would highly recommend that others look into it as well.
Well, thank you so much. This has been an extraordinary discussion. I hope that anyone watching the program will take the time not only to read your book, but the books you recommended. And I actually hope you'll send me.
I have to show my book. It's available on Amazon. So please,
Excellent.
to the folks, if you are interested in anything you've heard while we slept, pick it up on Amazon.
Yes, in addition to that, if you could send me also the list of all the other literature that you mentioned for my own interest, I would love to peruse that as well because not because I have too much time on my hands, but because this is an extraordinarily important issue, and there are always all these tidbits and angles that get missed if they're not properly connected to each other. Names, timelines, all of these things are very, very important to note and study and understand if we have any chance of preventing something like that from happening again.
Absolutely. I will happily offer you those titles of those books. And I'm in debt to those journalists and writers myself. I couldn't have written my book without their work.
Thank you so much, and I really appreciate your time. Everyone watching the program, please take the time to read the book. And the question that I raised with the title of the program, who is actually responsible for the corruption of our democracy? Well, in my opinion, it's not Putin or Donald Trump or any of the people that we've mentioned. It's actually ourselves. We have failed to pay attention to the corrupt practices that undermine our business, our legal system, our political system every day. We have allowed too many people to get away with too many things. And of course, these blind spots are going to be exploited by bad actors, domestic and foreign. So the next thing to do is to wake up, start paying more attention, and start prioritizing what we want to prevent from happening.
I couldn't agree more.